He signed the eviction notice with a smirk. That was what Evelyn Mercer remembered most. Not the words, not the cold snap of the lawyer's voice reading the document aloud. Not even the moment she understood that the man she had trusted with 7 years of her life had transferred every asset they owned into his mistress's name 3 months before filing for divorce. What she remembered was the smirk. Like she was an inconvenience, he was finally clearing off his ledger. She was 41 years old, standing in the hallway of a house that no longer had her name on the deed, holding a carpetbag with 2 dresses, a silver hair comb her mother had left her, and $31. The furniture was already gone. The bank account had been emptied. Her husband, former husband, was in the parlor laughing with his attorney about something that had nothing to do with her, because she had already stopped mattering. She didn't cry. She had done her crying the night before, alone in the kitchen with the gas lamp turned low. Now she just walked out the front door and pulled it shut behind her. That door closing was the sound of one life ending. What came next, she hadn't figured out yet. If this story moves you, if you've ever had to start over with nothing but your own 2 hands, please subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The advertisement had been folded so many times the paper was soft as cloth at the creases. Evelyn had found it in the back of a St. Louis newspaper, wedged between notices for farm equipment and a patent medicine that claimed to cure rheumatism, melancholy, and poor digestion all at once. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for seamstress work, or perhaps a position as a housekeeper in one of the larger homes near the river district. Something practical. Something that would keep her fed while she sorted out what her life was supposed to look like now. But the advertisement had caught her eye the way a stone catches light. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was unexpected. Seeking a woman of sound character and practical nature for marriage and household management. Silver Ridge Ranch, Hays County, Kansas. Applicants should understand frontier conditions are not gentle and comfort is not guaranteed. Respond in writing to C. Hays, Dodge City. That was all. No mention of age, no description of the man, no promise of affection or companionship or any of the things women were supposed to want from marriage. Just sound character, practical nature, and a warning that the conditions wouldn't be easy. Evelyn had read it 4 times. Then she'd gone back to the seamstress listings, found nothing, checked the housekeeping positions, found 2 that paid barely enough to cover a room in a boarding house, and come back to the advertisement a 5th time. She wrote the letter that evening, sitting at the small desk in her rented room, choosing her words with the same care she'd once given to everything before she'd learned that care wasn't always enough to protect you. She told him she was 41, a widow. She used the word loosely, since legally she was divorced, but felt no need to explain that particular shame to a stranger, with experience managing a household, cooking, preserving, mending, and keeping accounts. She told him she was not looking for luxury. She told him she understood that ranching country was hard land and expected nothing from it that she hadn't earned. She did not tell him about the smirk. His reply came in 11 days, which she later understood was fast for a man who wrote as few words as Colton Hayes. Terms agreed. Travel arrangements enclosed. You will be met at the Dodge City Station. C. Hayes. There was a bank draft for the train fare folded inside. Enough to get her there and have a little left over. No warmth, no pleasantries, not even a period of getting-to-know-you correspondence. Just terms agreed and a draft. She cashed it the next morning and bought her ticket before she could think herself out of it. Oh. The train ride from St. Louis to Dodge City took 2 days and 1 miserable night on a bench seat that had been designed, she was fairly certain, by someone who had never once tried to sleep sitting upright. The woman across from her snored. The man beside her smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool. Somewhere around the Missouri border, a child in the next car cried for 40 minutes straight before finally going quiet. Evelyn sat with her carpetbag on her lap and watched the country change through the window. She'd never been this far west before. The land surprised her, not the dramatic canyon landscapes she'd seen in illustrated magazines, but something quieter and more unsettling. The trees thinned and then disappeared almost entirely. The sky got bigger. The horizon went flat in a way that felt like a rebuke, like the land was saying there is nowhere to hide out here, so don't bother trying. She thought about her mother, who had told her once that a woman's greatest mistake was confusing a man's ambition with his character. Her mother had been talking about Evelyn's father at the time, though she'd never said so directly. Evelyn had thought she'd understood the lesson. She'd married a man she believed was honest, steady, kind. She'd been wrong about all three, it turned out, though the wrongness had taken 7 years to fully reveal itself. She was not going to make the same mistake twice. What exactly she was going to do, she wasn't entirely sure. But she was fairly certain that a man who put the word character before the word comfort in a marriage advertisement was at least starting from a different place than the man who had smirked while his attorney read her out of her own house. That was something. She told herself that was enough to build on. Dodge City in mid-April smelled of cattle and dust and something else she couldn't immediately identify. Something iron and flat that she'd later come to recognize as the smell of hard work accumulated over years. The station was smaller than she'd expected, busy in a purposeful way, men moving with their heads down and their shoulders set like they had specific places to be and no patience for anything that slowed the getting there. She stepped off the train with her carpetbag and stood on the platform and waited. No one came for the first 10 minutes. She told herself this was fine. Trains ran late, people ran late, the ranch was outside town, any number of things could account for it. She set her bag down and watched the platform empty around her until she was one of only 3 people left, and she was beginning to calculate what a boarding house might cost for one night when she heard boots on the wooden planks behind her. He was not what she'd imagined. She hadn't spent much time imagining, truthfully. She'd found that imagining led to expectations, and expectations led to disappointment, and she'd had enough of both. But whatever vague outline she'd sketched in the back of her mind, the man walking toward her didn't fit it. Colton Hayes was maybe 45, built like someone who had spent decades doing work that didn't care whether you were tired. Wide through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same material as fence posts. His face was weathered in a way that might have been handsome once and had settled into something more complicated, not ugly, just hard in the way that land gets hard when it hasn't had enough rain and isn't going to apologize for it. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He looked at her carpetbag. Just the one. Something moved across his face, not sympathy, not contempt. More like information being cataloged. "That everything?" "Yes." He nodded once, picked up her bag before she could reach for it, not gallantly, just efficiently, the way you'd pick up a tool that needed carrying, and said, "Wagon's out front. It's 2 hours to the ranch. You can sleep if you need to. Road's rough." That was the entirety of their first conversation. She followed him to the wagon. Well, he hadn't lied about the road. It was not a road so much as a suggestion, 2 ruts in the grass where wagons had agreed to travel over enough years that the agreement had become permanent. The wagon bounced and jolted over every variation in the ground, and Evelyn gripped the seat rail and kept her spine straight, and did not complain because she had the strong sense that complaining would be noted and filed away with the single carpetbag. Colton drove the way he seemed to do everything, without wasted motion, without conversation, without any apparent need for acknowledgement from the world around him. He'd pulled his hat down against the afternoon sun and fixed his eyes on the middle distance, and that was where they stayed. She tried once. "How long have you had the ranch?" "Since I was 23, he said. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. She tried again 20 minutes later. "Your advertisement mentioned a daughter." This one got a slightly longer silence before the answer. "Clara. She's 9. "Does she live at the ranch year-round?" "She lives with me." His voice had shifted in a way she couldn't entirely interpret. Not angry exactly, but something closed off, like a door that looked open until you tried to walk through it. "I don't send her away. I didn't mean to suggest. I know what you meant." She stopped trying after that. Silver Ridge Ranch materialized out of the Kansas plain with the particular self-assurance of something that knew exactly what it was. The main house was large, not ostentatious, but large in the way of places built by people who intended to stay and intended to need the room. 2 stories, timber and stone, a porch that ran the full width of the front. Beyond it she could see the outbuildings, the corrals, horses moving in the late afternoon light. Further out, cattle. More cattle than she'd ever seen at once. It was clear the land worked. It was equally clear that the house did not. The porch had a loose board on the second step, She noticed it when Colton skipped that step automatically without thinking, the muscle memory of someone who'd been avoiding it for months. The curtains in the front window were drawn, but one had come partly off its rod. There were tools left on the porch railing that had no business being there. None of this was catastrophic, but it was the kind of accumulation that happened when the person who noticed small things had stopped being present. Colton set her bag inside the front door and said, "I'll show you the room." The room was upstairs, clean in a stripped-down way, with a narrow bed and a window that looked east over the plain. There was a washstand and a chair and a hook on the back of the door. She appreciated the simplicity. She'd had a house full of things once, and the things hadn't protected her from anything. "Supper's usually at 7, Colton said from the doorway. "Bunkhouse cook handles the men. You'd be responsible for the house." "I understood that from the advertisement." He looked at her a moment. "There's a list on the kitchen table, things that need doing. Previous women found it helpful to have it written down." The phrasing snagged at her. Previous women, plural. "How many?" she asked. He seemed like he might not answer. Then, 3, before you." "What happened to them?" "They left." "Why?" Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a clench, but close. "Said the ranch was too isolated. Work was too hard. Said—" He stopped. "Reasons." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to leave because of isolation or hard work." "That's what they all said." He turned and went back down the hall. She stood in the room for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch settle around her, the distant lowing of cattle, the clank of something metal in the barn, wind against the window glass. Then she went downstairs to find the kitchen. The kitchen was where hope went to fail. She understood that immediately. Not because it was dirty, it was clean enough technically, but because it was the kitchen of a house where nobody cooked anymore. The stove had been used recently, but without care, the kind of use that gets food made and nothing else. The pantry was sparse in ways that didn't make sense for a ranch this size. There should have been preserved goods, cured meat, dried fruit. What she found instead were staples, and not enough of them, and a smell that told her the last woman who'd really worked this kitchen had left some time ago. On the table, as promised, was the list. It was long. It was also, she noticed, written in a hand that had started precise and gotten increasingly abbreviated as it went, like a man who'd begun with intentions and run out of patience for his own intentions halfway through. She was reading through it when she heard the back door open. The girl was small for 9, with her father's dark hair and a wariness in her eyes that was too old for her face. She was wearing a dress that had been hemmed badly, probably by someone who knew what a hem was supposed to look like without quite knowing how to make one. And she was carrying a notebook pressed to her chest like a shield. She stopped when she saw Evelyn. They looked at each other. "You're the new one," the girl said, not unkind, just factual. "I'm Evelyn," she said. You must be Clara." The girl didn't confirm or deny this. She was looking at Evelyn with the measuring look of someone who had been through this before and wasn't going to commit to anything based on first appearances. The last one cried when she saw the kitchen. "I haven't cried," Evelyn said. "No." Clara seemed to be cataloging this. "What do you think of it?" Evelyn looked around the kitchen again, at the empty shelves, the sad stove, the list of things undone. "I think it needs work," she said. "Most things do," Clara said, which was an odd thing for a 9-year-old to say, but she said it like she'd heard it enough times to have absorbed it. "Have you eaten?" Evelyn asked. Clara looked at the window. It was past 6. "Not yet." "What usually happens for supper?" "Mrs. Albright left at noon on Tuesday," Clara said. "Mrs. Albright was the one before you. Papa gave me bread and cheese for supper Tuesday and yesterday. This morning there was oatmeal." Evelyn set the list down on the table. "All right," she said. "Let's see what's in this pantry." She found enough. Barely, but enough. Potatoes. Dried beans that had been soaking in their own intentions for too long. Cornmeal. A heel of salt pork that was still good. Some onions hanging from a nail that were just starting to think about going soft, but hadn't committed to it yet. She got the stove going while Clara sat at the table and watched her with those ancient eyes and wrote something in her notebook every few minutes. "What are you writing?" Evelyn asked, not because she needed to know, but because the silence was the working kind and didn't need to be filled, but also because the girl had been alone long enough. Clara looked up. I keep a record, she said. Record of what? A pause. Then, carefully, the women who come here. Evelyn kept her hands moving, peeling potatoes. And what do you record? What they do the first day. Whether they look scared, whether they ask about Papa's money, whether they cry about the kitchen. A beat. Whether they feed me. She didn't look up from her notebook when she said that last part. Her voice had stayed even, but there was something underneath it that Evelyn recognized. The particular careful flatness of a child who had learned not to sound like she needed things. Evelyn put the potatoes in the pot and didn't say anything for a moment. What did the other three do? She asked finally. Clara turned a page. The first one asked about the silver service the first hour. The second one said she had a headache and went upstairs and stayed there until morning. The third one, Mrs. Albright, she cooked for 2 weeks. She was all right. Clara considered. She made good biscuits, but she didn't like the men coming in for meals, and she didn't like how far the nearest town was, and she cried about that. Not the kitchen, the distance. Do you miss her? Clara thought about this with more genuine consideration than most adults gave to the same question. I miss the biscuits, she said finally. I don't miss watching her be unhappy. The pot was on. Evelyn cut the salt pork into the cast iron and got it started. The smell of it hitting the heat filled the kitchen in a way that made the whole room feel different, less abandoned, more purposeful. Can I ask you something? Evelyn said. Clara's pen stopped. Yes? Your notebook, what does it say about me so far? The girl looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment Evelyn could see exactly what kind of woman Clara Hayes was going to become in 30 years, if the world didn't grind it out of her. Sharp, careful, fair, the kind of person who watched everything and judged nothing hastily. It says you didn't cry, Clara said. It says you went straight to the pantry. It says you asked if I'd eaten before you asked anything about the ranch. She looked back down at her notebook. That's the best first page so far, she said quietly. Evelyn turned back to the stove and blinked once, hard, at nothing in particular, and kept her hands moving. Colton came in at 7 exactly, with 2 ranch hands she hadn't met yet, men who stopped in the doorway when they smelled the food and looked at each other with an expression that had more surprise in it than was quite polite. Didn't know there'd be supper, one of them said. He was young, maybe 25, with a sunburned neck and the look of someone who said everything he was thinking without quite realizing he was doing it. There is now, Evelyn said. She set the pot on the table, the cornbread beside it, the salt pork in its pan. Colton stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, then at her, then at Clara, who had put her notebook away and was sitting up straighter than she had been all evening. He didn't say anything. He sat down. The 2 ranch hands introduced themselves while they were already reaching for food. The young one was Danny. The older one was a quiet man named Reeves, who nodded at her and kept his eyes on his bowl once it was full, which she took as a compliment. They ate. The food was simple because it had to be simple. She'd had an hour and limited supplies, and that was the truth of it. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and nobody at that table pretended otherwise. Clara ate with the focused attention of a child who was genuinely hungry, and Evelyn was careful not to watch her too obviously. Halfway through the meal, Colton said without looking up, "The beans needed salt." "I know," Evelyn said. "You were out." He looked up then. "I'll need to go to town," she said, "or send someone. I made a list." He held her eyes for a moment. Something moved in them that she couldn't name. Not approval exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like he was revising an estimate. "I'll see to it," he said. He went back to his bowl. Across the table, without looking up, Clara opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote something down. Evelyn did not ask what it was. She already knew she'd find out eventually. The list she'd made that first night had 14 items on it. By morning, she'd added 6 more. Evelyn was up before the sun, not because she was trying to make an impression, but because she'd always been an early riser, and old habits had a way of surviving everything else that didn't. She'd lain in the narrow bed listening to the ranch wake up around her. The distant sound of horses shifting in the corral, a door opening and closing somewhere in the bunkhouse, the particular pre-dawn quiet that wasn't actually quiet at all once you started listening to its pieces. And then she'd gotten up, dressed in the dark, and gone downstairs to the kitchen. The stove was cold. She built the fire herself, the way her mother had taught her when she was 8 years old, with paper and kindling laid just so. Because there was a right way to build a fire and a wrong way, and the wrong way was the one that wasted wood and took twice as long. While the stove was coming up to temperature, she went through the pantry again in better light than she'd had the night before, and that was when the 6 additional items appeared on the list. No lard to speak of. The cornmeal was running low. There were no dried apples, no preserves of any kind, nothing that would hold through the summer if someone didn't put it up. The flour barrel was less than a quarter full and showed signs of having gotten damp at some point and recovered imperfectly, which meant whatever was baked with it would taste faintly of that damp if you weren't careful about it. She started coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it came to boil, looking out at the yard as the sky went from black to the particular deep blue that preceded gray. And she thought about what it meant that a ranch this prosperous had a pantry this thin. It meant nobody had been managing it. Not for a while. The money was clearly there. You couldn't look at the size of the operation, the quality of the horses in that corral, the number of men in the bunkhouse, and think otherwise. But money and management were two different things entirely, and Silver Ridge Ranch had one without the other. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with both her lists and started reorganizing them by priority. Danny appeared first, which she was coming to understand was simply his nature. He arrived places before he was needed and talked before he was spoken to, not out of rudeness, but out of a kind of excess of presence, like he took up slightly more space in the world than his actual body required. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and sniffed. "Coffee's on." "Yes," she said. "Mrs. Albright never had coffee going till 7. It's 6:15. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her list. "What you writing?" "Things the pantry needs." He made a sound of agreement that had some weight behind it. "Yeah, we've been eating out of the bunkhouse cook supplies mostly. Big Amos doesn't mind, but he grumbles about it. Says feeding the house out of his stores wasn't in his agreement." "Big Amos is the bunkhouse cook?" "Amos Teller. He's not actually that big. Medium-sized, really. But he's been here 14 years, so that's just what everyone calls him." She added "speak with Amos" to the list. Danny watched her write it. "You making a list of people too?" "I'm making a list of everything," she said. He thought about this. "Mrs. Albright made lists. She just never did most of them." "I'm not Mrs. Albright." He looked at her with the open, uncomplicated assessment of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. "No," he said, like he was confirming something he'd been working out since last night's supper. "I don't guess you are." He helped himself to coffee without asking, which told her something about how the house had been running, and she decided not to correct it because some things mattered and some things didn't. And a man helping himself to coffee in a kitchen where the coffee was made for general use was approximately 3 places below her current concerns. Clara came down at 6:30 with her hair unbrushed and her notebook already in her hand, and Evelyn noticed immediately that the hem on the girl's dress was worse than she'd thought the night before. Not just badly done, actually coming apart in one place, on the right side, where the thread had given up the pretense of holding things together. She didn't say anything about it yet. She poured Clara a cup of milk from the jug she'd found in the cold box. Someone was at least keeping that stocked, probably Colton himself from the look of it, a single practical gesture in an otherwise unmanaged house, and set it on the table. Clara sat, looked at the milk. "Thank you." "Do you like porridge?" "It's all right." A pause. "I like eggs better." "Do you have chickens?" Clara blinked, like this was an unexpected question. "There's a coop. Around back." Another pause, this one longer. "I don't think anyone's been collecting." Evelyn put down her pen. "Show me after breakfast." The girl's expression didn't change dramatically. It was a small shift, the kind that happened below the surface, something easing slightly, like a door that had been stuck being opened just enough to let in air. "All right," Clara said. The chicken coop situation was, as it turned out, one of those things that looked like a small problem until you opened the door, and then it was clearly not a small problem. Not a catastrophe, the birds were alive and functioning, but there were eggs that had been accumulating without collection for several days, and the coop itself was in the kind of disorder that accumulated when nobody was paying regular attention. Evelyn made a mental note, added 3 more items to the list, and collected 24 eggs in her apron, which was more than she'd expected, and fewer than there would have been if someone had been doing this consistently. Clara walked beside her back to the house with her notebook open, writing something as she walked, which Evelyn suspected would have made her trip over her own feet if she'd been paying less careful attention to the ground. "What do you write about in the mornings?" Evelyn asked. "What I see," Clara said. "What happens?" "You said you keep a record of the women who come here." "I keep a record of everything," Clara said. It was an echo of what Evelyn had said about the lists, and she wasn't sure if the girl had done it deliberately or if it was just the natural tendency of a child who absorbed what was around her. "Papa says you should always write down what you observe before you forget it, because memory changes things." Evelyn glanced at her sideways. "Your father told you that?" "He used to." Clara's voice stayed even, but there was something in the tense of it, used to, that had weight. "Before Mama died, he talked more. He read to me most nights. He had a shelf of books in his study." "Does he still?" "The books are still there." A beat. "He doesn't read them." They walked the rest of the way back to the kitchen without speaking, which was the kind of silence that didn't need filling because it already had enough in it. By the time Colton appeared at 7, the kitchen smelled of eggs and fried potatoes and fresh coffee, and there was cornbread in the pan that was slightly uneven on top because the oven ran a little hot on the left side, and she hadn't known that yet, but it was cooked through and it was good. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way she was beginning to understand. He read most things, quietly, thoroughly, without giving away what the reading told him. "Supply list is on the table," she said, without turning from the stove. "When someone goes to town." She heard him cross the kitchen, heard the paper picked up. A pause. "This is extensive," he said. "The pantry is nearly empty. We have a bunkhouse cook who handles supplies." "For the bunkhouse." She turned now because some conversations needed eye contact. "The house kitchen is a different matter. Someone needs to be responsible for it." He looked at the list. His expression didn't change, but something shifted slightly in his jaw. "I'll arrange for a wagon to go Thursday." "I'd like to go myself." He looked up. "I need to see what the general store carries," she said. "I need to know prices. I need to understand what's available locally and what has to be ordered. If you're going to have a household that functions, someone has to know these things." He held her eyes for a moment. She didn't look away. She'd spent a year in her previous life deferring to a man's preferences in the hope that deference would be mistaken for virtue, and she wasn't going to repeat that particular lesson. "Thursday," he said finally. "Danny can take you." He folded the list, put it in his shirt pocket, sat down at the table. Clara appeared from somewhere and slid into her chair with the frictionless efficiency of a child who had learned to be unobtrusive, and Evelyn set plates in front of them both and poured coffee and then sat down herself because she was not the hired help and she wasn't going to behave like it. Reeves came in just behind Danny, and the 5 of them ate breakfast in the particular quiet of people who didn't yet know each other well enough to have found their conversational rhythms but were working toward it, and nobody complained about the food, and the cornbread disappeared completely, and Evelyn noted with the corner of her attention that Colton had 2 pieces of it. She didn't mention it, but she noted it. The morning revealed things about the ranch that she filed away in the same careful way Clara filed things in her notebook. She hadn't expected to be handed a tour. Colton had gone out to the range by 7:30, and Danny had following shortly after, and Reeves had disappeared in the direction of the barn without a word, which seemed to be the most words she was likely to get from Reeves on any given morning. She took herself around the place with her list and her own 2 eyes, and what she found was the pattern she'd already begun to suspect. A ranch that was excellently managed in every respect that had to do with cattle, horses, land, and profit, and not managed at all in every respect that had to do with the house and the people living in it. The vegetable garden at the back of the house was salvageable. It had been started at some point. There were the remnants of rows, some volunteer plants that had seeded themselves and come back without anyone asking them to, but it hadn't been properly turned or planted this spring. The soil was decent. If she got seeds in soon, there was still time to have something by midsummer. The root cellar was better stocked than the pantry, which she took as evidence that Colton did understand preservation instinctively. There were potatoes, turnips, some cured pork that was still good, but the root cellar was a hedge against disaster, not a plan for daily life, and someone had been drawing it down without replenishing it. The laundry situation was what it always was, in a house with working men and no one managing it, behind in a way that would take a week of steady work to correct, and then require vigilance to keep corrected. She stood in the yard looking at the clothesline, which had one forgotten rag on it that had been there long enough to fade, and she thought, this is what happens when you pay a woman poorly enough that she leaves, 3 times in a row. And don't ask yourself what that says about your arrangements. She didn't have the luxury of being judgmental about it. She was here now, and the work was here, and that was the whole of the situation. She found Amos Teller at the bunkhouse just before noon. He was, as Danny had noted, not particularly large, a compact man in his late 50s with forearms like bridge cables and a face that had the specific quality of someone who had cooked for hard-working men for so long that he'd permanently adopted their economy of expression. He was stirring something on the bunkhouse stove when she knocked on the open door, and he turned around and looked at her with eyes that didn't give much away. "You're the new housewoman," he said. "Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I wanted to introduce myself and ask a few things." He turned back to his pot. "Danny said you were all right. Said you made good cornbread. The oven runs hot on the left side. Always has." A beat. "I told Mr. Hayes about it 2 years ago. He said he'd see to it." "Has he?" "Evidently not." She stepped into the bunkhouse and looked around. It was a different kind of order than the house. Rougher, built for function rather than comfort, but genuinely maintained. The floor was swept. The bunks were tidy. The stove had clearly been well cared for over many years. "Danny said you've been supplying the house kitchen from your stores." Amos snorted. "Not out of the goodness of my heart. Mr. Hayes compensated me, but it's not the right arrangement. A house kitchen ought to have its own management." He looked at her sideways. "You planning to manage it?" "That's the idea." He turned all the way around to face her, which she had the sense was a gesture he didn't make for everyone. He looked her over with the same frank assessment she was beginning to associate with people who worked hard and didn't have patience for pretense. The first one they sent, Mrs. Crane, she lasted 9 days. Nice enough woman, not suited to ranch life. Second one, Miss Porterfield. She was younger than Clara almost. I don't know what Hayes was thinking sending for someone that young. She barely knew how to boil water. Mrs. Albright was the best of the 3. He paused. She could cook and she worked hard, but she'd been a town woman her whole life and the isolation got into her head after a while. Started crying at dinner, not every night, but enough. "And you think I'll do the same?" "I don't think anything yet," Amos said, which was honest enough that she respected it. "I observe. That seems to be a habit on this ranch." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. "Mr. Hayes is careful. He's been careful since Mrs. Hayes died. Clara was 4. He turned back to his pot. "He doesn't trust easily. He watches people for a long time before he decides what they are. And while he's watching, you either prove yourself or you don't." He stirred. "The women who left, they didn't prove themselves. Not because they were bad women. They just weren't the right fit. Hayes Ranch isn't for everyone." "What does it take?" she asked. "To fit here?" Amos considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "You have to not mind being needed," he said finally. "Some people mind it. They want to be chosen, not needed. Out here, the needing comes first. The choosing takes longer." She thought about that on the walk back to the house. She thought about a man who had sent for 3 different women because his ranch needed managing and his daughter needed something he couldn't figure out how to give her alone, and how each of those women had left, and how he'd sent for a 4th, and what it cost a man like Colton Hayes to keep doing that. She thought about Clara with her notebook, writing down who fed her and who didn't. She thought about what it meant to be needed before you were chosen, and whether she minded that. She didn't think she minded it. The afternoon was laundry and the garden. She started with the laundry because it was the more immediate problem, hauling water and heating it on the stove and working through the backlog with a steadiness that she'd learned from her mother, who had believed that domestic work done well was an act of dignity regardless of what else was happening around it. Her mother had washed laundry on the worst days of her life and maintained that there was something clarifying about work that had a clear beginning and a clear end. Evelyn had tested this theory extensively over the past months and found it broadly accurate. Clara appeared halfway through the afternoon with her sleeves already rolled up, which Evelyn hadn't asked for and wasn't going to turn down. The girl was stronger than she looked, and she worked without commentary, which turned out to be one of Clara's more useful qualities. She either talked or she worked, and when she worked, she worked. They had most of it on the line by 3 o'clock, and the yard smelled of clean, wet cotton in the warm Kansas sun. and Clara stood looking at it with an expression that Evelyn couldn't immediately categorize. Mrs. Albright didn't do laundry, Clara said. How'd the clothes get washed? They didn't, mostly. Papa sent things to town with Danny sometimes. A pause. It cost a lot. I imagine it did. Clara looked at her sideways. You're not going to just do the washing and the cooking. It wasn't quite a question. No, Evelyn said. What else? Garden needs planting. Pantry needs restocking. The chicken coop needs a proper clean. The porch step needs fixing before someone goes through it. She glanced at the girl. Oven runs hot on the left side. I'd like to look at it and see if it's adjustable or if it needs new parts. Clara stared at her. You know about ovens? I know about most things that need fixing, Evelyn said. You live long enough and your options are learn or wait for someone else to do it. Clara wrote something in her notebook. What did you write? Evelyn asked. Clara looked up. She fixes things herself. A beat. None of the others did that. Danny came back from the east pasture at 4:30 with a cut on his forearm from a wire he'd snagged on, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway with his arm wrapped in his own bandana in the way of someone who was hoping to be noticed without quite having to ask for help. Evelyn cleaned and dressed it without making a production of it, which seemed to be exactly what Danny needed. Someone to take care of the thing efficiently without either dismissing it or elevating it to drama. That's better than what I do myself, he said, looking at the wrapped arm. You've been doing your own first aid? Mrs. Albright didn't like blood, he considered. Miss Porterfield fainted one time when Reeves came in with a rope burn. I don't faint, he grinned. It was the uncomplicated grin of someone who hadn't yet accumulated enough disappointments to make him careful with his reactions. I know. I could tell. How? He thought about it. The way you looked at the kitchen last night. Most people, they see a mess, they either get flustered or they get their back up. You just... He moved his good hand in a describing motion, assessed it, like you were counting the pieces before you started putting them together. She taped the last edge of the bandage and stepped back. That's what my mother called taking stock. Good habit. Where'd you grow up? Ohio. You? Pennsylvania originally, moved east later. She didn't elaborate on that. Danny had the good sense not to push it. He was 25 and sometimes foolish, but he could read a door that didn't want to be opened, and he respected that without needing to understand it. Well, he said, standing up and flexing his wrapped arm experimentally, I appreciate it. Don't snag yourself on wire again. He laughed. I'll try. Reeves says I do it every spring like it's a tradition. What does Reeves think about it? Reeves doesn't say much about anything. He reached the door and looked back. But he ate 3 bowls last night. That's a vote of confidence from Reeves. Supper that second night was better than the first. Not because she'd had more to work with. She hadn't. Not yet. But because she knew the stove now, knew its left side temperament, knew how to bank the heat down 15 minutes before she needed it and bring it back upright. And the result was biscuits that were actually biscuits, and not the uncertain territory the first night's cornbread had occupied. Colton came in at 7 again with Reeves and Danny and one other man she hadn't yet met, a quiet Texan named Curtis, who had the bearing of someone who'd spent many years on horseback and had the posture to prove it. She shook his hand and put another plate on the table without comment, and Curtis looked at the table with the expression of a man who had eaten enough bunkhouse food to appreciate what was in front of him. Biscuits, Danny said, as if announcing an arrival. Sit down, Danny, Reeves said. First word she'd heard from him all day. The meal had a different quality than the night before. Not warmer exactly, these men didn't run to sentiment, but more settled. Like they'd started to adjust to the idea that there was going to be food at this table at a predictable time, and it was going to be decent food, and that adjusting was happening in them the way all real adjusting happened, beneath the surface of what they said. Clara sat in her usual chair with her notebook beside her plate, closed this time. She was watching Colton. He was watching his food, or appearing to, in the way he did most things, with more internal activity than the surface showed. About halfway through the meal, he said, without preamble, "The garden's been turned." It wasn't a question. "I started it this afternoon," Evelyn said. "The back half needs more work. I'd like to plant early this week if someone can spare time to help me haul the rest." Danny can. "Hey," Danny said, not quite a protest. "Tomorrow morning," Colton said. "Yes, sir?" Danny addressed his biscuit. Curtis looked up from his plate for the first time. You know what grows out here? I'll learn, Evelyn said. Tell me what hasn't worked. He raised his eyebrows slightly, like this was an unexpected approach. Tomatoes want more water than we usually get. Squash does fine, beans, if you get them in before June. Sweet corn? Mostly, depends on the summer. She nodded, committing it. What about the neighbors? Do any of them garden seriously? I'd like to know who's had success with what. Curtis and Reeves exchanged a look that she couldn't fully interpret, not hostile, more like two people registering something they hadn't expected. The Garfield place, 2 miles east, Reeves said. Longest sentence she'd heard from him yet. Mrs. Garfield puts up enough to supply half the county. Thank you. Reeves looked back at his plate. She had the sense she'd used up her Reeves conversation for the day. Colton was watching her again, that same careful, measuring quality she'd noticed on the wagon from town. Not suspicious exactly, but not open either. Something in between, like a gate that was latched but not locked. Clara picked up her notebook and opened it to a new page. Stop writing at the table, Colton said. I'm not writing, Clara said. I'm reading what I wrote earlier. Clara. She closed it. But she looked at Evelyn across the table with an expression that said, I'll show you later, as clearly as if she'd spoken it aloud. And Evelyn looked back at her with an expression that said, all right, in the same silent language. And Colton watched this exchange happen without commenting on it, which told her something. He noticed everything. He just wasn't sure yet what to do with what he noticed. The week moved. It moved in the way that hard work weeks move, which was not slowly. Hard work weeks almost never move slowly, but with a weight to each day, a sense of matter being moved from one place to another, a visible difference between Monday and Friday if you knew where to look. She got seeds in the ground with Danny's help on Wednesday. He was a decent helper once he stopped talking long enough to listen to what needed doing, and he had a rancher's instinct for what soil wanted, even if he didn't know the gardening side of things specifically. She showed him the spacing, and he got it right, and only occasionally tried to turn a 10-minute task into a 20-minute task by means of commentary. Thursday, she went to town. Dodge City at close range was more complicated than it had been on her arrival. She'd been too disoriented then to take it in properly. Now she walked its main street with her list and her market basket and her eyes open, and she filed away the layout of it, the names of the businesses, the faces of the people who nodded at her when she mentioned Silver Ridge Ranch. Some of those nods had a quality to them she couldn't quite read, not unfriendly, but knowing, like a story they'd heard the end of before she'd arrived. The man at the general store was named Harlan Marsh, 50-ish, with the cautious cheerfulness of someone who extended credit and had learned to be careful about it. You're Hayes's new housekeeper, he said. His wife, she said. It was the first time she'd said it aloud, and it sat strangely in her mouth. Not wrong exactly, just unfamiliar, like a coat that wasn't broken in yet. Something moved in Harlan Marsh's expression. Recalibration. My apologies, Mrs. Hayes. The previous arrangements were... He stopped himself. Welcome. What can I get for you? She went through the list with the efficiency of someone who had been provisioning households for 20 years and knew the difference between a necessary expense and a wasted one. She bought what the kitchen needed and didn't buy what it didn't, and when Harlan Marsh tried twice to sell her something she hadn't asked for, she declined politely both times without leaving room for a third attempt. When she was done, she asked him to put it on the ranch account, which he did, and she wrote down the total in the small notebook she'd brought for the purpose, because she intended to know exactly what the household cost each month, and she intended that knowledge to be useful. On the way out, she ran into a woman coming in. Mabel Garfield was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the sunburned face and direct gaze of someone who had farmed her own land for a long time. She looked at Evelyn the way someone looks at a thing they've heard about and are now seeing for themselves. You're the one Hayes sent for, Mabel said. No preamble. Evelyn Mercer, she said. Hayes now, I suppose. Mabel considered this. First time I've heard a Hayes woman introduce herself both ways. Habit, Evelyn said. I'm still getting used to it. Something in Mabel's face settled. Not warmth exactly. She wasn't a warm first woman, Evelyn could see that. But something more genuine than the cautious friendliness of Harlan Marsh. You're the fourth, Mabel said. I know. What makes you think you'll do better than the others? It was an intrusive question by most standards. Evelyn didn't take it as an intrusion because it wasn't. It was the question of a woman who had watched the previous three arrive and leave and had her own opinion about why, and who was deciding whether to share that opinion. "I haven't thought about doing better," Evelyn said. "I've thought about doing the work." Mabel studied her. "Reeves says you know which end of a hoe is useful." "Reeves talked to you about me?" "Reeves talks to my husband when they're fixing fence together. What Reeves says finds its way to me." She shifted the basket on her arm. "The girl, Clara, how is she?" "She's keeping her notebook," Evelyn said. Mabel smiled at that, and it was the first genuine smile Evelyn had seen from an adult since she'd arrived. "She's been keeping that notebook since she was 6. She gave me 4 stars once. Colton was furious." The smile faded. "He loves that girl to his bones. He just doesn't know how to be what she needs right now. He's been like that since Helen died." Helen was his wife. 3 years ago, fever. It came fast. Mabel looked out at the street for a moment, and what was in her face was the look of someone remembering something they'd thought they were done, grieving, and weren't. "He shut down after that. Not cruel. Colton Hayes has never been cruel, but shut down. He runs the ranch like a machine. The house just—" She shook her head. "That girl has been eating whatever Danny or Reeves put in front of her most days. It's not right." Evelyn thought of Clara saying, without inflection, bread and cheese for supper, Tuesday and yesterday. "I know," she said. Mabel looked at her directly again. "Are you going to stay?" She thought about the narrow bed, the flat Kansas sky, the distance to the nearest town, 3 previous women who hadn't. She thought about Clara's notebook and Amos Teller's observation that the needing came before the choosing. She thought about a man who watched everything and decided nothing quickly, who had his reasons for that and had paid for them without understanding yet what they'd cost him. "I'm going to stay," she said. Mabel nodded once, the way people nod when they want to believe something and are cautiously beginning to. The week's end found the kitchen transformed in the small, unglamorous way that real transformation happened. Not dramatically, not all at once, but by the daily accumulation of things put right. The pantry had been restocked. The garden had been planted, or most of it. The chicken coop had been cleaned, and the hens were producing reliably now that someone was collecting daily. The laundry was current. The loose porch step had been shimmied with a piece of scrap wood she'd found in the barn. Not a permanent fix, but it wouldn't send anyone through the boards while a proper fix was arranged. The oven's hot side she'd learned to manage. Not solved, it still ran hot, but managed. The way you learn to manage the things you couldn't fix immediately, by understanding them well enough to work around them. Saturday evening, the men who'd been out on the range all week came back, and there were suddenly 8 people for supper instead of 5, and she adjusted without comment because adjustment without comment was what the situation called for. And the table was crowded and noisy in a way it clearly hadn't been for a long time, and she stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled up and fed them all. At some point in the noise of it, she looked up and found Colton watching her from the doorway. Not the measuring look. Something different, slower, more uncertain. Like a man who had made a calculation he'd been confident in and was now finding it didn't account for something he should have factored in from the beginning. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove because there were 8 people waiting on supper, and the moment didn't need to be anything more than what it was. But Clara, who noticed everything, had her notebook open under the table. Evelyn didn't ask what she was writing. She already suspected it was something she'd earned. Colton Hayes had a test. He hadn't invented it consciously. It had evolved the way most things evolved on a working ranch, out of necessity and repeated experience, until it had its own shape and its own logic. He didn't think of it as a test. He thought of it as observation. But the ranch hands knew about it, and Amos knew about it, and Mabel Garfield knew about it in the way that Mabel Garfield knew about most things that happened within a 10-mile radius of her farm, which was to say thoroughly and without having been officially told. The test was simple. He would leave for 3 days. Not disappear. The men would know where he was, and it was genuine work, a ride out to the far northeast pasture where the fence line had been giving trouble since February and needed proper assessment before summer grazing began. It was real work that needed doing. But the timing of it had always been deliberate, and everyone who understood Colton Hayes understood that the timing was the point. He left the first 3 women within their first 2 weeks. Mrs. Crane on day 4. Miss Porterfield on day 3. He'd come back to find her at the kitchen table writing a letter and the stove cold, and Clara eating dried crackers she'd found in the pantry. That one had ended the conversation before it started. Mrs. Albright had made it to day 8 of his absence before something in the distance and the silence had cracked her open in a way she couldn't recover from. And he'd come back to find her red-eyed and apologetic and already packing. Each time he returned, he knew within 10 minutes what the 3 days had cost him. He left for the northeast pasture on the Monday of Evelyn's second week, saddled up before dawn with Reeves and Curtis and 2 other hands, and told Danny to stay behind for the garden work and whatever else needed doing at the house. He did not tell Evelyn he was going or for how long. He did not tell her either that he was watching for what she did when she thought no one of consequence was watching. Protect. She noticed he was gone by 6:30. Not because she'd been waiting for him or monitoring his movements. She'd been banking the stove, and the particular rhythm of the morning had simply changed. No boot steps from the room above her. No sign of him in the yard when she looked out for the hens. She asked Danny at breakfast, casually, the way you'd ask about weather. Northeast pasture, Danny said, helping himself to the last biscuit with the easy authority of someone who'd established territorial rights over the last biscuit by the second week. Fence trouble. Could be 3 days, could be 4. All right, she said. Danny looked at her. Waiting, she understood, for something. Some sign of the reaction that had characterized the previous women's responses to the same information. Anxiety, maybe. Or the particular calculating stillness of a woman mentally reassessing her investment. She got up to refill the coffee pot. That's it? Danny said. That's what? You're not... He stopped, started again. The others, when he left, they... Another stop. Never mind. She looked at him steadily. He's running a cattle ranch, Danny. He can't sit at the kitchen table every day to make sure I'm behaving. Danny looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, short and genuine, the laugh of someone who's had a thing explained to him so simply it makes him slightly embarrassed it needed explaining. No, he said. I guess he can't. The 3 days without Colton had a quality she hadn't anticipated. Not easier. The work was the same work. There was nothing about his presence that had been making the days harder, but different. Quieter in one register, busier in another. Without the particular gravitational pull of him in the house, the other relationships had more room to develop their own shape. Clara came out of herself in increments. It happened the way things happen with children who'd been practicing containment. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small expandings that you'd miss if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. The first morning Colton was gone, she came down to breakfast and sat at the table and then, without asking or announcing it, opened her notebook and began writing while the eggs were still cooking, and she did it with the ease of someone who was testing whether the rule applied when its enforcer was absent. Evelyn said nothing about the notebook. Clara looked up, noted the silence, wrote something. He makes you put it away, Evelyn said, not accusingly, just placing the fact on the table. At meals, Clara said. He thinks it's rude. Is it? Clara considered this with genuine philosophical interest. Probably, but so is not talking to anyone at supper, and nobody says that to him. Evelyn put a plate in front of her. He's quiet at supper. He's quiet most places. A pause. He used to not be. When Mama was alive, he was different. He laughed more. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children reported hard truths that adults hadn't figured out how to soften into something manageable. After she died, he just got smaller, not in size, in, she searched for the word, volume. Volume, Evelyn repeated, like he turned something down, like a lamp. Clara looked at her plate. I don't think he knows how to turn it back up. Evelyn sat down across from her. The morning was quiet except for the wind and the distant sounds of the ranch starting its day. What do you remember about your mother? Clara looked up. It was clearly a question she'd been asked before and had developed a specific relationship with. She smelled like lavender. She sang when she thought nobody could hear her. She had a laugh that was too loud for church. A pause. Papa used to call her his best argument against good sense. That sounds like a compliment. He meant it as one. Clara looked back at her notebook. I wrote it down when I was 6 because I was afraid I'd forget it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That was smart thinking. I write down everything I'm afraid of forgetting, Clara said. Papa says memory changes things. He means it as a warning. I think it's also why he doesn't look at the books anymore. He's afraid of what he'll remember. Tuesday arrived with a problem. Not a disaster, a problem. The kind that materialized specifically to test what kind of person you were when you had to handle it without the person the world assumed was responsible for handling it. 2 ranch hands came in from the east pasture mid-morning, one of them half supporting the other. The one being supported was a man named Walt, 30-something, who had been stung badly by something out in the tall grass. Not once, not twice, but many times. A ground nest disturbed, and he'd caught the worst of it before he could get clear. His forearm was swelling, his face was flushed and wrong-colored, and he was having trouble getting enough air. Evelyn had seen an allergic response before. Not this bad, but bad enough to know what she was looking at. "Get him inside," she said. The other man, a stocky Kansan named Pierce, looked around instinctively for someone with more authority to defer to, found only her, and made the calculation that this was not the moment for institutional uncertainty. They got Walt to the kitchen bench. He was conscious but fading in the direction of panic, which was the most dangerous thing about his condition at the moment. Panic constricted airways that were already under strain. "Look at me," she told him. She said it quietly, but with enough force that he did it. "You're going to breathe, slow. I need you to do that for me right now." He tried. It was ragged and not great, but he tried. She went to the pantry with the specific focus of someone who had cataloged its contents thoroughly and knew exactly what was in it and where. She had no proper medicinal stores yet. That was on a list she hadn't gotten to. But she had what was basic, and she moved through what she had with the focused calm of someone who couldn't afford to be anything else right now, because the alternative was Walt not breathing. She got him through it. Not easily, not smoothly. There were 15 minutes in the middle where Pierce was on the edge of riding for town at a full gallop, and she wasn't certain he shouldn't. But Walt's breathing steadied by degrees, the swelling peaked and then stopped progressing, and by noon he was pale and exhausted on the kitchen bench with a cold cloth on his arm and a cup of something warm in his hands, and Pierce was sitting at the table with the expression of a man who'd just realized how close things had gotten. "Where'd you learn that?" Pierce asked. "Experience," she said. She was washing her hands at the basin, steadying herself now that the crisis had passed, and she could afford to feel how much her hands had been shaking. "Nursing experience?" "Living experience." She dried her hands. "Get me a list of anyone out here who's had a bad response to stings before. I want to know. And I need someone to ride to town this week for proper medical supplies." Pierce nodded with the energy of a man who was very willing to do anything she asked at the moment. "What do you need?" She told him. He wrote it down with the focused attention of someone who understood now that her lists were worth writing down. Walt stayed on the kitchen bench through the afternoon. Clara sat with him for an hour, reading to him from one of the books she'd brought down from her father's shelf. She'd asked Evelyn first, almost formally, "Do you think it's all right if I take one?" And the image of it, the girl reading aloud to the man in the same quiet voice she used for her notebook, was the kind of thing that stayed. Word of the incident moved through the ranch, the way all news moved through small, close-quarters communities, faster than the facts, slower than the exaggeration, arriving at something in the middle that was more or less true. By supper that evening, the remaining hands had heard a version of it, and the supper table had a different quality, the specific attentiveness of people who have updated their understanding of someone and are still adjusting to the new position. Danny said, "I heard you talked Walt through it without him passing out." "He needed to stay calm," she said. Pierce said his hands were shaking. "Pierce's hands or Walt's?" "Walt's." "Yes." "He said yours weren't." She looked at Danny. "I wasn't going to help him by being frightened in front of him." Danny looked at his food for a moment. "That's..." He searched for the word. "That's a particular kind of discipline." "It's not discipline, it's just knowing that your feelings can wait." Reeves, who hadn't spoken yet, said quietly, "That's the same thing." She hadn't thought of it that way before. She didn't argue with it. The second morning Colton was gone, she found the study. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for the household account book, which Danny had said with perfect confidence was somewhere in the study. "I think Mr. Hayes keeps it in the study," in the way that men who don't manage household accounts describe where household accounts are kept. She'd knocked, received no answer for obvious reasons, and gone in. The study was a room that had once been lived in. She could tell that the way you could tell about a room, the way the furniture was arranged, not for efficiency but for comfort. The chairs angled toward the fireplace in a way that invited someone to sit and talk rather than just work. The desk was in order in a functional way, the papers stacked with precision, the pen holder clean. But the bookshelves, she'd been told about the bookshelves, and still the sight of them stopped her for a moment. They were full, floor to ceiling on 2 walls, a library that would have looked impressive in a city townhouse and was extraordinary in a Kansas ranch house. Not for show either. These were red books, spines cracked, some of them twice, some of them with folded corners or slips of paper still marking a page that hadn't been returned to in 3 years. She found the account book where Danny had approximately said it would be, and she found something else on the corner of the desk without looking for it, a small framed photograph, the kind made in a studio, the paper a little faded at the edges. A woman and a child. The woman was laughing at something outside the frame. The child was Clara, at maybe 4 years old, wearing a dress with a large bow, looking up at her mother with an expression of complete and unconscious devotion. Evelyn stood with the account book in her hand and looked at the photograph for a moment. She set it back down exactly where she'd found it and left the study and closed the door behind her. The account book told its own story. She sat with it at the kitchen table for an hour that afternoon, going through it with the methodical care she'd given to every set of numbers she'd ever been responsible for, which included 7 years of household accounting that her former husband had ultimately credited to himself in the divorce proceedings. She knew how to read numbers the way some people read text, for what they said and what they didn't say. What the Silver Ridge account said was this: the ranch was prosperous beyond what even the visible scale of it had suggested. The cattle operation was exceptionally well run, generating revenue that would have made most Kansas ranchers stare. The land holdings were extensive. The investments, there were investments, carefully noted, modest but consistent, were sound. What the accounts didn't say, couldn't say in numbers, was the gap between what came in and what actually got spent on the house. The disproportion was stark. The ranch operation was funded with the confidence of a man who understood exactly what a thing was worth. The household, food, supplies, maintenance, the basic necessities of people living inside 4 walls, was funded with the distracted afterthought of a man who was managing his grief by concentrating on the parts of his life where he still knew what to do. She closed the book. She understood him better now. Not completely, she wasn't foolish enough to think that, but better. He wasn't neglecting Clara and the household from indifference. He was neglecting them because managing them required him to be present in a way that living things demanded, and numbers on a page did not. Cattle could be counted and moved and sold. A 9-year-old girl with a notebook full of things she was afraid to forget required something else entirely. And he'd lost the woman who had known how to do that part, and the loss had taken the knowledge with it. She opened the account book again and began making notes in the margin, carefully, in pencil so they could be erased if he objected to them. Things that needed budgeting, things that were being underspent in ways that would cost more later. A line item she'd noted for medical supplies, which had no existing allocation and should have had one years ago. She was still writing when Clara appeared in the doorway with her hair in 2 uneven braids that she'd clearly done herself and her boots on the wrong feet. "Clara," Evelyn said. The girl looked down. "Oh." She sat down on the bench by the door and switched them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this was not an unusual error. Come here," Evelyn said. "Let me do your hair properly." Clara approached the table with a wariness that wasn't quite wariness, more the careful movement of someone who wanted something and was trying not to want it too visibly. She stood while Evelyn unraveled the uneven braids and worked through the tangles, which were significant. "When did you last have this properly brushed?" A pause. "Mrs. Albright did it sometimes." "And before that?" "Papa tries." A longer pause. "He's not very good at it." "Most people aren't, without practice." She worked through a knot at the back, and Clara winced and didn't say anything. "Your mother used to do it." "Every morning," Clara said. "She said the state of your hair in the morning set the tone for the whole day." She wasn't wrong. She braided it properly this time, evenly, with the practiced ease of someone who had done it to her own hair for 40 years and knew the architecture of a good braid. Clara sat still for it with a quality of stillness that was different from her usual watchfulness, less analytical, more simply present. The account book, Clara said after a while. Yes. Papa keeps that locked. Evelyn's hands paused for just a moment, then continued. It wasn't locked. It was in the desk drawer. He locks the drawer. The drawer was unlocked. Clara was quiet for a moment. He never unlocks it. Evelyn tied off the second braid and stepped back. Sit up straight. Clara sat up straighter and then turned around to look at her with those considering eyes. Did you look at it? I'm the one managing this household. I need to understand what the household can spend. Clara looked at her for a long moment. The others didn't do that. No, Evelyn said. They asked him for money when they needed it. Isn't that the same? It's the opposite, she said. One is managing. One is depending. Clara thought about this with the seriousness she gave to most things that were worth thinking about. Then she opened her notebook and wrote something. Colton came back on the afternoon of the third day, not the fourth. He came back early because the fence assessment had been completed faster than expected. Reeves was a remarkably efficient man when he was focused on a physical problem, and Colton had known this for 12 years, and because there was a part of him, the part he didn't discuss with anyone, including himself, that always came back a little faster than he told himself he would. He rode into the yard, and the first thing he noticed was the smell. Not food exactly. It was mid-afternoon, between meals. Something else. Something green and growing, which was the smell of a worked garden. And the garden on the south side of the house was clearly worked, laid out in proper rows with small signs of new growth just becoming visible. The second thing he noticed was the sound of voices. He tied his horse at the post and followed the sound to the back of the house. And what he found was Evelyn at the vegetable beds with Mabel Garfield, both of them kneeling in the dirt with gardening gloves, and the specific posture of two women who had been at a task long enough to have also had a significant conversation. Mabel looked up first. Colton. Mabel. He looked at Evelyn. I didn't know you were acquainted. We met in town, Evelyn said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him without anything he could read as performance in it. Mabel's been generous with advice. She has 6 varieties of squash that do well in this soil. I know what Mabel grows, he said, which came out slightly more clipped than he intended. Mabel stood up, brushed dirt from her gloves, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had known him for 9 years and was not intimidated by his tone. Clara seemed well this morning, she said. I stopped in for an hour. She showed me her notebook. Something moved in his face. She showed it to you. Parts of it. Mabel looked at Evelyn, then back at him. I'll leave you to it. Evelyn, the squash seeds. I'll send them with Jacob on Friday. Thank you, Evelyn said. Mabel collected her basket and walked around the side of the house without additional ceremony, which was entirely in keeping with how Mabel operated, and which Colton had always appreciated until just now when it left him in the garden with a woman who was looking at him with level patience. The fence? She said. Repaired. He looked at the garden, at the rows, at the quality of the work in them. Danny helped with this? Monday and Tuesday morning. He's got good instincts for it, actually. He doesn't think so. Colton looked at her. You told him that. I told him what I observed. People work better when their work is seen. She pulled off her gloves. Walt's arm is healing. The swelling came down by yesterday evening. Pierce brought the medical supplies back from town yesterday. I've given them their own place in the pantry. He was quiet for a moment. He'd heard about Walt from Curtis on the ride back, briefly, the way men on a working ride exchanged information, facts without embellishment. Woman at the house handled a sting situation. Walt's fine. He hadn't asked for details. He'd thought about it for the last 6 miles. You should have sent for me, he said. And done what while waiting? She said. He needed managing in the moment he was in front of me, not in an hour when a rider could find you. I'm saying if something had happened, nothing happened. She held his eyes. I'm not going to apologize for handling what needed handling. He was quiet again. Longer this time. The afternoon was warm and the garden smelled of turned earth and growing things, and somewhere behind the barn, a horse was making its opinion known about something in the way horses did. I looked at the household accounts, she said. The shift in his expression was small, but she saw it. Something that tightened briefly. That book is in my desk, in an unlocked drawer. I keep that drawer locked. She looked at him with a patience that was not unkind, but was also not apologetic. It wasn't locked when I needed the book. I didn't take anything. I made notes in pencil on the allocation page. You can erase them if you want." He looked at her for a long moment. The tightening in his face resolved into something more complicated. Not quite anger, not quite respect. Something between them, fighting it out. "Notes," he said. "Budget notes. Allocation gaps. A line for medical supplies, which should have existed." She picked up the gardening gloves and basket with the air of someone who had said what needed saying and was now ready to move on to the next thing. "You're understaffing the house budget by about 40% against what a household this size should be running. You've compensated by paying for things piecemeal, sending laundry to town, supplementing from Amos's stores, ignoring things until they became emergencies. It's inefficient, and it costs more in the long run than a proper budget would." He stared at her. She met his eyes. "I'm not telling you what to do with your money. I'm telling you what I found in the accounts and what I think. You asked me here to manage this household. I can't manage something I don't have numbers for." I was silent for a period that stretched to the point where most people would have filled it with something to soften the edges. She didn't. "You've been here 2 weeks, he said finally. "I know." "The others never—" He stopped. "I know," she said again. He looked away, out at the plain beyond the garden fence, and she could see him working through something that he hadn't been prepared to work through today, that he'd expected to come home and find a situation he'd already seen before and understood how to respond to. Instead, he'd found the garden planted and the medical supplies organized and the household accounts annotated, and Mabel Garfield on her knees in the dirt like she'd been coming here for years. "Dinner's at 7, she said. She started toward the house. "The oven still runs hot on the left. I think it needs a new part. I put that in the notes too." She was 3 steps away when he said, "What did the note say?" "About the oven." She stopped, turned. "That the baffle plate on the left firebox is probably warped. You'd need to look at it to confirm, or have someone who knows the model look at it. It's an older stove. Parts might need to be ordered." He was quiet. "Or you buy a new stove," she said. "The accounts suggest you can afford it." She went inside. "What?" He stayed in the garden for a while after that. Reeves found him there eventually, which surprised neither of them since Reeves had a tracking instinct that extended to people as much as livestock. He stood beside Colton and looked at the rows without commenting on them. "Garden looks good," Reeves said finally. "Yes." "Walt's arm?" "She told me. He's fine." "Pierce told me what happened." Reeves looked at the plane. "He said she was calm." "She seems to be." Colton looked at his hands. "She was in my study, in the accounts." Reeves said nothing for a moment. "She managing the household?" "Yes." "Then she'd need the accounts." Colton looked at him sideways. Reeves had the specific quality of a man who was rarely wrong and knew it, and had learned to say very few words because the few were usually enough. "She's different," Colton said. He didn't mean it as a compliment or a criticism, just as an observation that needed a landing place. "Yes," Reeves said. "I don't know what to do with different." Reeves was quiet for a long time, long enough that the evening started changing the light on the plain. That particular Kansas late afternoon where the sun got lower and the shadow of everything got longer, and the grass went gold in a way that made the whole landscape look like it was pausing to consider itself. "You always wait too long," Reeves said. "I wait until I know." "You wait until you're certain," Reeves said. "That's different. Certain takes forever. No takes about 3 weeks." He looked at him, brief and direct, the way Reeves looked at things. "Sometimes you know before that." He walked back to the barn. Colton stood in the garden until the light changed again. Well, supper was beef and roasted vegetables, and a gravy she'd built from the drippings, with a patience he wouldn't have guessed at. And there was enough of it for the 8 men who came in from the various parts of the ranch, and the 3 who'd come back from the pasture with him. And Clara sat at her customary place with her notebook closed on the table beside her plate. Not hidden, just closed, a compromise she'd apparently arrived at herself without being asked. He watched Evelyn move through the kitchen and the table with the efficiency of someone who had already learned the geography of the room well enough to stop thinking about it consciously. She knew who drank their coffee black and who wanted sugar. She knew that Curtis wouldn't take vegetables if he could avoid it without someone making them unavoidable on his plate. She knew that Danny would eat whatever was put in front of him with equal enthusiasm and therefore needed no management. She knew that Reeves ate slowly and deliberately and shouldn't be hurried. She'd learned all of this in 2 weeks, without being told, just by paying the kind of attention that most people didn't think to pay until it was too late to learn what they'd missed. He noticed also that she laughed once during the meal. Not a performance of a laugh, a real one, short and surprised, at something Danny said that was actually funny. It changed her face in a way he hadn't seen before, made it younger, made it look like the face of a woman who had liked laughing once and had gotten out of the habit and was now cautiously remembering that she could. Clara saw it too. He watched his daughter watch Evelyn and write something in her notebook, quickly, 2 or 3 words. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said, and closed it. After the meal, when the hands had dispersed and Danny was doing the thing Danny did where he stayed slightly too long at the table, in hopes that conversation would continue on its own, without anyone having to initiate it, Evelyn began clearing plates. Colton took his coffee to the counter by the window instead of heading to the study as he usually did. Danny correctly understood this as a sign that it was time to leave and left. Clara looked between the 2 adults, made her own assessment, and took her notebook upstairs with unusual discretion. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked as it cooled. "The notes in the account book," he said. She was at the basin with her back to him. "You looked at them." "I looked at them." He set down his coffee cup. "The allocation for the household. You said 40% short. Give or take, I'd need a proper month of expenses to be precise." "The stove part." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'll order it." "Thank you." "And a new budget. For the household." He paused. "I want to see the numbers. How much you're spending and on what. Monthly." She turned from the basin. "You want to review the household accounts." "Is that a problem?" She shook her head. "No, it's the right thing to do." She dried her hands. "I'll keep a clear record." He looked at her. The lamp was low and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and she was standing there with a dish towel in her hands and a composure that he'd been trying to find the edge of for 2 weeks and hadn't found yet. "The Garfield woman," he said. "You've known her 8 days. 9. And she's in my garden. She knew things I needed to know. I asked her. She came." She set the towel down. "People generally come when they're asked properly." He was quiet. She was looking at him with the level patience he was beginning to understand was simply her default setting, not a tactic, just the way she occupied herself in space. Fully, steadily, without apology. "The first 3 women," he started. "You don't need to explain them to me," she said. "I wasn't going to explain them. I was going to say that they told me what I wanted to hear and then left when the reality didn't match what they told me." He turned the coffee cup again. "You haven't told me what I want to hear once." She considered this. "Would it help if I did?" "No." "Then there's no reason to start." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his coffee cup, and he said, without quite looking at her, "The account book. Next month. I want to see what you've done with it." He walked toward the study. "Colton," she said. He stopped. "The book's on your shelf," she said. "Clara misses hearing you read." He stood with his back to her. The hallway was dim beyond the kitchen light. He stood there long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond, that she'd gone 1 step past where she should have gone, and she started to reach for the dish towel again. "I know," he said. He went down the hallway. She stood in the kitchen after the study door closed, in the quiet of the cooling stove and the settled house, and she thought about what it meant to know something and still not be able to reach it, and what it cost a person to keep knowing it and doing nothing, year after year, because the knowing was the most they could manage. She understood it better than she'd like to. She put out the lamp and went upstairs. From the study below, after she'd been in bed for perhaps half an hour, she heard the faint sound of a page turning. She didn't say anything about it in the morning, but she heard it. The page turning had not been a single night's event. Evelyn understood this gradually, the way you understood most things about Colton Hayes. Not from what he said, but from what changed, incrementally, in the shape of the house around him. The study door, which had always been shut by 8 o'clock, now sometimes stayed open until 9. Clara, who had developed an instinct for her father's closed-off hours as precise as a weather instrument, began drifting toward the study in the evenings with the careful nonchalance of someone pretending to be going somewhere else. Twice in the first week after Colton's return from the northeast pasture, Evelyn heard his voice from behind that door, low, unhurried, reading. and Clara's silence, which was the particular silence of a child who had stopped breathing in order to hear better. She didn't mention it to either of them. Some things were not hers to touch. They just needed room to happen. What was hers to touch was the list, which had evolved over the weeks from a collection of immediate crises into something more like a managed system. The pantry ran on a proper rotation now. The garden was producing its first tentative results: radishes, lettuce, the early beans Curtis had said would work if she got them in before June, and she had. The chicken coop yielded reliably. The household accounts, which she recorded in a separate ledger she'd bought in town and kept on her side of the kitchen desk, had their first clean monthly summary ready for Colton's review. He reviewed it on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with his coffee and the ledger open in front of him. She sat across from him with her own cup and waited while he read. He read slowly. She'd noticed this about him. He read everything slowly, not because he was a slow reader, but because he read to understand rather than to finish. He turned pages and went back to earlier pages and made small sounds that weren't words. At one point he looked up and said, "The feed allocation, that's coming out of household?" The chickens in the kitchen garden used the same feed supplier. It made sense to consolidate the billing. He looked back at the page. And the medical supplies. Running costs per month. I've estimated forward based on the first month. It'll vary. He was quiet for a while. She drank her coffee and didn't fill the silence because the silence was working and filling it would only slow things down. "You're under the number I gave you," he said finally. She'd been given a household budget 2 weeks after his return from the pasture, not discussed, just an amount written on a piece of paper left on the kitchen table one morning with no further context, which was apparently how Colton Hayes did things he'd decided to do, but didn't want to make into a conversation. The amount had been reasonable, slightly more than she'd estimated she needed, and she'd been under it by $11.40 in the first month. "Some things cost less than I anticipated," she said. "I'd rather come in under and return the difference than go over and ask for more." He looked at her. The difference. She slid $11.40 across the table. He looked at the money, then at her. Something moved through his expression that she recognized now. That particular recalibration, the revising of an estimate. He did it every time she did something he hadn't expected, and she was beginning to build a private catalog of what those moments looked like. "Keep it," he said, "for next month. I don't carry money forward without accounting for it." "Then put it in the ledger." "Under what heading?" He looked at her steadily. "Buffer." She wrote buffer at the bottom of the page, added the amount, and closed the ledger. May came in warm and immediately ambitious about it. The Kansas spring that everyone had been cautious about. Too dry, too windy, one late frost still a possibility, according to Amos, who had been watching Kansas springs for 14 years and didn't trust them until June, turned out to be a reasonable one, and the garden that had been tentative in April became assertive in May. Evelyn was out there most mornings before breakfast, not because the garden required that much attention yet, but because the morning was the best hour and the garden was her thinking space, the same way the kitchen was her working space, and the two were different things. Clara started coming with her. Not every morning. The girl had her own rhythms and Evelyn respected them. But most mornings, with her notebook and sometimes without it, and they developed an early morning language of two people doing quiet work together that didn't require much speech. Clara had good hands, she'd discovered, patient, careful, with an instinct for the fragile things that some people never developed regardless of age or instruction. "You're good at this," Evelyn told her one morning, watching her thin the bean seedlings with the right amount of ruthlessness. Clara didn't look up. "Mama had a kitchen garden. I helped her." A pause. "It's one of the things I remember properly. Not just the feeling of it. I remember specific days. What we were planting. What she said." "What did she say?" Clara thought about it. "She said that gardens didn't care how you felt. They just wanted you to show up." She thinned another seedling. "I thought it was a sad thing to say when I was little. Now I think it was practical." Evelyn looked at her sideways. "You think practical is the same as sad?" "I used to." Clara set down the seedlings and looked at the row. "I don't think so anymore." Well, the first complication came in the form of a man named Gerald Pruitt. She'd heard him mentioned obliquely before. He had land adjacent to the southeast corner of Silver Ridge, had been there for years, had a relationship with Colton that Reeves described as business, in the specific tone Reeves reserved for things he thought were managed incorrectly, but which were not his business to say so about directly. She'd filed it away and thought nothing more of it until the morning he rode up to the house unannounced. Evelyn was on the porch fixing the roof overhang on the far end that had come partly loose. She'd been up the ladder for 20 minutes and had 2 nails in her teeth and a hammer in her hand when she heard the horse, and she came down the ladder and turned around and found him sitting on a horse about 15 feet from the porch, with an expression she recognized immediately from a previous life. It was the expression of a man taking inventory of a woman he'd just decided to have an opinion about. Gerald Pruitt was perhaps 50, heavy-set in the way of a man who'd once been physically capable and had allowed prosperity to soften the edges, with a face that looked like it had settled into an expression of permanent self-satisfaction sometime around his early 30s and hadn't revisited the choice since. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, making it sound like a question. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. She'd learned enough about the neighbors in a month to know his name and face, even without introduction. She kept the hammer in her hand without being pointed about it. He looked at the ladder, at the overhang, at her. Something in his expression shifted toward amusement, which was not a neutral kind of amusement. "Hayes, have you doing roof work?" "Nobody asked me to. I noticed it needed doing." He looked around the yard with the proprietary survey of someone who considered themselves to have opinions about the property. "Colton around?" "He's out on the range. Is there something I can help you with?" "Ranch business," Pruitt said. "I'll come back." He didn't move to leave, though. He sat on his horse and looked at the house the way someone looks at something they're calculating the value of. "You're the 4th one he sent for," he said. "I'm his wife," she said. Same flat correction she'd given Harlan Marsh on day 9. It didn't get more comfortable with repetition, but it got more automatic. Pruitt's expression did something she didn't like. Not quite a smile. Helen was something, let me tell you. Ran this house like a general. Colton won't find that again." He looked at her. "No offense." "Some taken," she said pleasantly. He blinked. People who made remarks designed to belittle usually expected one of 2 responses. Either the woman absorbed it quietly or she got flustered. She'd given him neither. "I'll come back for Colton," he said. "I'll tell him you called." He tipped his hat with the performance of courtesy that wasn't, turned his horse, and rode back down the track. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched him go, and then she went back up the ladder and put the 2 nails in her teeth back where they needed to go, because the overhang wasn't going to fix itself while she thought about Gerald Pruitt, and she'd learned a long time ago that the best response to men like that was to simply continue with whatever you were doing when they'd interrupted. She was still on the ladder when Danny came around the side of the house and stopped and looked up at her. "Was that Pruitt?" he said. "Yes." "What did he want?" "Said ranch business." "Wanted Colton." She hammered the second nail. "What's his actual business with the ranch?" Danny was quiet for a moment in the specific way he was quiet when he was weighing whether something was his to say. "He's been wanting to buy the southeast section for 3 years. Colton won't sell. Pruitt keeps coming back to renegotiate." He paused. "The southeast section is the best water access on the property. Whoever has it has leverage over the whole ranch." She came down the ladder. "Does Colton know how much he wants it?" "He knows. He just doesn't—" Danny stopped. "He doesn't talk about it much. With anyone." She looked at Danny steadily. "Pruitt's been patient for 3 years." "Yes." "Why?" Danny opened his mouth and closed it again. She could see him working through something. "He's got a new partner. Came in last fall. Someone with money. Pierce said he heard Pruitt talking about it in town. Said things were going to change at Silver Ridge. Said it like he knew something." She looked at the track where Pruitt had gone. "Tell me the next time he comes," she said. "You think it's something to worry about?" "I think patience that specific usually has a reason," she said. She picked up her toolbox. "And reasons are worth knowing." Colton came back at midday and she told him about Pruitt's visit in the same tone she'd tell him about a delivery or a supply question, factual, unembellished, without editorial. He listened with the expression he wore for information he was processing rather than responding to. "What did he say exactly?" he asked. She told him, including the remark about Helen, which she delivered without change of tone. Something moved through Colton's face at the Helen remark. Not grief, exactly. Or not only grief. something with more edge to it. He says things like that. I know, she said. I'm not telling you because it bothered me. I'm telling you because a man who leads with that kind of remark is establishing something, trying to. Colton looked at her. He wanted me to feel like a substitute, she said. Something temporary. I don't think that's just his general attitude towards second wives. I think he wanted me to feel unsteady here. The expression on Colton's face shifted into something she recognized as the look he wore when an idea he hadn't had was arranging itself in his head using material she'd just given him. You think it's connected to the southeast section? I think he's been patient for 3 years, and patience usually means he's waiting for something to change. I think he looked at me and decided I might be the thing that changes it. He was quiet for a long moment. How? I don't know yet. That's why I'm telling you. He looked at the table, at his hands. The southeast section is non-negotiable. Then it would help to know what he thinks gives him leverage. She paused. Danny mentioned a new partner, someone with money who came in last fall. It might be worth knowing who. He looked at her with the look he'd given her in the garden and in the kitchen and over the account ledger, the look that was perpetually recalibrating something. You've been here 5 weeks, he said. I know. How do you... He stopped. How do I know which things to pay attention to? She looked at him steadily. I paid the wrong kind of attention for 7 years. I got very good at learning from the experience. He didn't ask about the 7 years. She hadn't expected him to. But he filed it. She could see that, the way he filed everything. And he looked at her for another moment, and then he said, I'll write to a man in Wichita. He knows Pruitt's business dealings. That would be useful, she said. She got up to start the midday meal, and behind her she heard him pull the account ledger toward him and open it, which was what he did when he needed to think, but didn't want to appear to be sitting and thinking, and she decided not to mention that she'd noticed. Mabel Garfield came on Friday with the squash seeds she'd promised and stayed for 2 hours, which was how Mabel operated. She arrived with a stated purpose, and then the stated purpose turned into conversation, and the conversation turned into its own kind of purpose. They were at the kitchen table with coffee and the remains of a batch of oat cakes that had turned out slightly too dense because she'd misjudged the milk, a fact she'd acknowledged to herself and filed under things to correct next time, because kitchen work was like any other work, and the mistakes were how you got better. When Mabel said, Pruitt was in town Tuesday. He was here Wednesday morning, Evelyn said. Mabel's eyes sharpened in the way of a woman who processed information at speed. What did he want? Said ranch business. Wanted Colton. She paused. He was looking at the property with a particular kind of interest. He's always looked at this property with particular interest. Mabel wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. What you need to know about Gerald Pruitt is that he married a woman for her family's water rights 40 years ago, and he's been doing variations of that same transaction ever since. Land, water, leverage. That's the only business he understands. Danny said he has a new partner. Harmon Webb, Mabel said, without hesitation. She said it the way she said things she'd looked into thoroughly. Out of Topeka. He's not a rancher. He's a land speculator. Buys properties under pressure, develops them or sells them to railroad interests. He and Pruitt have been in correspondence since last fall. She looked at Evelyn. I have this from my husband, who has it from 3 separate sources, so it's reliable. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Why would a land speculator partner with Pruitt for the southeast section of this ranch? Mabel looked at her. Because there's a railroad survey from 18 months ago that shows the most viable route for the western extension runs within 4 miles of Silver Ridge's southeast corner. The kitchen was very quiet. Does Colton know about the survey? Evelyn asked. He knows there's been railroad interest in the area. He doesn't know about the specific survey, as far as I can tell. He doesn't pay attention to Pruitt the way Pruitt pays attention to him. She paused. Colton thinks Pruitt is an irritant. He doesn't think of him as a threat. He should. Evelyn sat with this for a moment, arranging the pieces the way she arranged supply orders, by urgency, by dependency, by what needed to happen before what else could happen. The southeast section, she said. If Pruitt and Webb got access to it, what could they actually do? Control Silver Ridge's water in a dry year. Force a buyout or a sale of adjacent land at below-market prices. Clear the way for railroad access fees that would benefit Webb's speculation properties upriver. Mabel's voice was steady and hard and completely without performance. Colton's father built this ranch for 40 years. Colton's built it for 20. If Pruitt gets that section, he doesn't have to buy the rest. He just has to wait. Evelyn stood up and went to the window. The yard was quiet, the May afternoon warm, everything looking exactly as secure and settled as it had for the past 5 weeks. "I'll tell Colton today," she said. "He won't like that, you know," Mabel said. "He doesn't have to like it." She turned from the window. "He has to act on it." Mabel looked at her with something that went past the cautious approval of their early weeks together into something that was simply respect, the kind that didn't need to be articulated to be real. "I've been waiting 9 years for someone to say that to him," she said. "Has no one?" "His foreman, his lawyer in Dodge City. Me, twice." Mabel picked up her coffee. "He listens. He thanks you. He goes back to running the cattle." She paused. "You're different. People keep saying that. It keeps being true." She told him that evening, not at supper. She waited until the table had cleared and Clara had gone up with her notebook, and Danny had finally taken the hint from the general energy of the room, and then she told him. All of it. Mabel's information, the railroad survey, Harmon Webb, what the Southeast section meant to someone with a speculator's patience and the right partner's leverage. He listened the way he listened, completely, without interruption, giving nothing away. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for long enough that the stove's evening settling was the only sound in the room. "Mabel told you this," he said. Mabel confirmed it. "I'd already started asking the right questions. She had the answers." "You've been asking questions about Pruitt." His voice wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't neutral either. "I've been paying attention," she said. "It's what you do when something doesn't feel right." He stood up and walked to the window, which was what he did when he needed to think without looking at anyone. She let him have the window. "The railroad survey," he said. "I knew there'd been surveyors. I didn't know where they'd put the line. Within 4 miles of the southeast corner. Mabel's source is reliable." He was quiet again. She watched the set of his shoulders in the lamplight and thought about what it cost a man like this to have been looked out for by someone when he hadn't asked for it and hadn't expected it. "I need to talk to my lawyer in Dodge City," he said. "I know." "And have someone verify the survey." "Yes." "And find out who Webb has been talking to besides Pruitt." "That too." He turned from the window. "How did you know it was important?" "About Pruitt. Most people would have told me he came by and left it at that." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because he wanted me to feel like I didn't matter here," she said. "And when a man tries that hard to make someone feel small, he usually has a reason that has nothing to do with the person he's doing it to." Colton looked at her. The lamplight was low and the kitchen was warm, and he was looking at her with something she'd not seen in his face before. Not the measuring look, not the recalibrating look. Something older and quieter than either of those. "Evelyn," he said, and then stopped. "It's all right," she said. "I haven't—" He stopped again. "I haven't thanked you for any of it." "You don't need to thank me. It's what I'm here for." "No." His voice had a firmness to it that came from somewhere genuine. "That's not the way you manage this house, the way you've handled the men, Walt, the accounts, Clara." He looked away and back. "Clara showed me her book last week." She was quiet. "She let me read the first pages," he said, "from when you arrived." He paused. "She'd written first entry. She asked if I'd eaten before she asked anything about the ranch." His voice was level. "Careful. That was the first thing she wrote about you." "I know," Evelyn said. "She told me. It mattered." He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said all the things that actually mattered to him. "It mattered more than you know." She looked at him and thought about Clara at 6 years old starting a notebook because she was afraid of forgetting, and Clara at 9 writing down who fed her and who didn't, and what kind of world that was for a child to be building her record-keeping system inside. "She's a remarkable person," Evelyn said. "You should tell her more often." He looked slightly stricken, the way people did when they knew something was true and hadn't done it, and couldn't defend why. "I know." "She's like you," she said. "She watches everything. She waits a long time before she decides what something means." She paused. "She's also like her mother, I think. From what you've both told me." Something crossed his face. Not grief this time, something more complicated. Helen would have liked you, he said. She would have said you were the only sensible thing I'd managed in years. It surprised her into a brief laugh, the real kind, the one she'd been cautiously rediscovering. High praise. From Helen? Yes. They were quiet for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet than the silences of the early weeks, less full of things unsaid and more full of things that had been said and had settled properly. I'll write to Dodge City tomorrow, he said, and I want to review the Southeast Section survey myself, whatever paperwork we have on it. The account ledger has a property section. I haven't touched it. I'll bring it to you, he said. You might see something I miss. She looked at him steadily. It was not a small thing for Colton Hayes to say. She accepted it as it was given, plainly, without inflation. All right, she said. June arrived with the full weight of Kansas summer, and with it the travelers. They came through every few weeks on the main road half a mile from the ranch track, wagons heading west, families relocating, a constant slow migration that had been happening since before the war and hadn't entirely stopped. Most of them kept moving. Occasionally someone needed water, or a wheel repaired, or had a sick child and needed a place to stop. Evelyn had started leaving the gate at the road track open on the days she expected traffic, with a hand-lettered sign that said water at the well. Knock at the house if needed. Colton had said nothing about it when he first noticed the sign. He'd looked at it for a moment and ridden on. A family stopped in mid-June, wagon-weary and poorly equipped, husband and wife and 3 children under 8, heading for Colorado territory with supplies that weren't going to last them. The wife had a cough that had been going since Missouri. Evelyn brought them in, fed them, looked at the cough, and gave her opinion of it. Not dangerous yet, but trending in a direction that bore watching, and did they have what they needed for the road ahead? And the family stayed for 2 days while the husband rested a horse that had been going lame since the Oklahoma border. Colton came home on the second evening to find 6 extra people at the supper table. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with the expression of a man updating a significant amount of information rapidly. Then he sat down. Danny, watching this from across the table, nudged Curtis. Curtis gave him a look that said, "Don't." The husband, whose name was Frank Hadley, had the worn-down dignity of a man who had made a decision he still believed in, but was paying a price he hadn't fully anticipated. He talked to Colton about the road conditions west, about what he'd heard about the Colorado claims, about what the land looked like past the Kansas border. Colton listened and answered and gave him specific practical information about the route that had the quality of things actually known rather than repeated. At some point, Hadley looked around the table, at the food, at the children eating steadily, at Evelyn moving between the stove and the table with the ease of someone in full command of her kitchen. And he said to Colton, "You've got a good household here." "Yes," Colton said. He didn't look at Evelyn when he said it. "I do." She was at the stove when he said it. She didn't turn around, but she heard it, and it went somewhere inside her and stayed there. The Hadley family left on Friday morning with 2 weeks of additional supplies loaded in their wagon, which Colton had arranged without announcement the night before. A conversation with Amos, a trip to the supply stores, a quiet transaction that he hadn't mentioned to anyone at the supper table, and that Evelyn had only discovered when she saw the wagon loaded in the yard at dawn. She found him by the corral fence after the Hadleys had gone, leaning on the top rail watching the horses. "That was generous," she said. "They needed it." "I know, I'm saying it was generous." He looked at her sideways. "You left the gate open for them." "I left the gate open for anyone who needed it." "I know." He looked back at the horses. "My father used to do that, when I was a child. My mother would put water and bread at the gate on summer days." He paused. "I'd forgotten." She stood beside him at the fence. The morning was clear and warm, and the horses were moving in the easy way of animals without urgency, and the ranch was making all its ordinary sounds around them, which had stopped being unfamiliar to her somewhere around the 4th week, and had become simply the sound of where she lived. "The letter from Dodge City came," he said. "I know. Danny left it on the kitchen table. My lawyer confirmed Webb. He's been buying land east of Pruitt's place. Small parcels, quiet purchases, nothing that would register unless you were looking at the pattern." He turned a corner post under his hand. "He's building access to the Southeast section, if Pruitt can get it." "What does your lawyer recommend?" "Legal protection on the section. A proper water rights filing that makes the access conditions explicit. He paused. And he said something else. He said a married man with a functioning household and a clear line of succession has a stronger claim against speculative pressure than a widower in a disputed domestic situation. She looked at him. He didn't know our specific arrangement, Colton said. He was speaking generally. A pause. But it's true regardless. The morning was very still suddenly, or it seemed still, the way things sometimes seemed still in the middle of something that was actually moving at considerable speed. Our arrangement, she said carefully. What we have. He turned from the fence to look at her directly, and the directness of it, after weeks of careful sideways approaches, was almost startling. Which is more than what I advertised for, more than I expected. He paused. More than I deserved to get, probably. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man who said things like that easily or often. She understood the cost of the sentence. Colton, she said. I'm not making a legal argument, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm saying, he stopped, started again. I'm saying that what we've built here, in 6 weeks, what you've done for Clara, for the house, he stopped a third time, which was 2 more stops than a man like him usually allowed himself, and that was how she knew it mattered. I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm accounting it. Then don't account it, she said. He looked at her. Just say the thing, she said. He held her eyes for a moment that stretched in the way that real moments stretched, the ones that were actually deciding something. You're not temporary, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with Pruitt or the southeast section or any of it, you're not temporary. This is your home. The morning was warm and the horses were moving, and somewhere in the house Clara was at the kitchen table with her notebook, writing down what she observed before she forgot it, the way her father had taught her and her mother had practiced. And the ranch was making its sounds around all of them, like it always had and intended to keep doing. All right, Evelyn said. It was what she said when something landed where it was meant to land. He understood that now. He turned back to the fence, and she stood beside him, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because the things that mattered had been said, and the morning had enough in it already without adding more. The letter from Harmon Webb arrived on a Tuesday. It came addressed to Colton Hayes, typed on formal letterhead from a Topeka land firm with the kind of dense professional language that was designed to sound reasonable while meaning something else entirely. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when Danny brought it in from the road, and she didn't read it. It wasn't hers to read. But she saw the return address, and she saw the way Colton's expression flattened when he opened it, and she knew before he said anything what kind of letter it was. He read it twice, set it on the table, looked at the window. Webb, she said. Webb. He pushed the letter toward her. She read it. It was 2 pages, careful and courteous in the way of documents that were neither, and what it said beneath the legal pleasantry was this: Harmon Webb, representing a consortium of land and transportation interests, wished to open formal discussions regarding the purchase of the southeast section of Silver Ridge Ranch and any associated water rights. The offer was generous. The number they'd put on the page was genuinely generous. She'd looked at enough of the accounts to know what the land was worth, and this was above that. And the letter noted that given the recent changes in the Hayes household, the consortium believed this was an advantageous moment for all parties to consider their long-term interests. She set the letter down. Given the recent changes in the Hayes household. He thinks I'm the instability, she said. Yes. Colton's voice was level. He sent for that number because he thinks a second wife in a household that's had 3 previous failed arrangements means the whole structure is uncertain. She looked at the letter. He's trying to use me as a pressure point. That's what my lawyer said when I wired him this morning. She looked up. You'd already wired him. I saw Webb's firm name on the envelope before I opened it. I sent the wire before breakfast. He looked at her. I've been slow about some things. Not this. She was quiet for a moment. Something settled in her. Not comfort exactly, but recognition. The difference between a man who learned and a man who didn't. What does your lawyer recommend? She said. File the water rights documentation this week. He's already drafting it. He paused. And respond to Webb in writing, formally. No ambiguity about where the ranch stands or who's standing in it. What do you want the response to say? He looked at her steadily. That Silver Ridge Ranch is not for sale. that the southeast section is not for sale, that the Hayes household is not the unstable situation he's calculated it to be. A pause. I wanted to say that clearly. Then say it clearly, she said. Don't let a lawyer soften it into something Webb can read two ways. Something moved in his face. Will you help me write it? She looked at him. In 7 years of marriage to another man, she had never once been asked that question. Not because her former husband didn't need help. He did, regularly, and she had provided it, invisibly, without credit, until the day she'd found herself standing in a hallway holding a carpetbag. She thought about that for exactly 1 second, and then she let it go, because the past was the past, and this was a different man in a different kitchen asking a different question, and the only thing that mattered now was the answer. Yes, she said. Get paper. They wrote it together at the kitchen table, which was where everything important at Silver Ridge seemed to happen. Not in the study, not on the range, but at this table that had been cold and empty when she arrived, and now was the center of the house's gravity. Colton knew what he wanted to say, and she knew how to say it without leaving gaps for interpretation. And between those two things, they produced a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and left nothing open. She read it back to him when they were done. That's it, he said. You're sure about the last line? The last line said plainly that any further correspondence regarding the purchase of Silver Ridge land or water rights would be directed to the ranch's legal counsel in Dodge City, and that Mr. Hayes considered the matter permanently closed. I'm sure, he said. She folded the letter. I'll have Danny take it to the post this afternoon. He nodded. Then, instead of standing up and going back to the range the way he usually did after a matter was settled, he stayed at the table, looking at the folded letter, then at his hands. Pruitt will push back, he said. He will. Webb will find another angle. Probably. Men like that usually do. It won't be quick, he said. It'll be a sustained thing. Months, maybe longer. She looked at him. I know. I need you to know that when I say this ranch is your home, I mean it in the full sense of that. Not just the house. The trouble that comes with the house. He met her eyes. All of it. She held his gaze. Colton. I arrived here with 1 carpetbag and $31 and a divorce I was ashamed of. I fixed your porch step with scrap wood. I reorganized your accounts in pencil in case you objected. She paused. I'm not afraid of sustained trouble. I've been managing it my whole adult life. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did what it had been quietly trying to do for weeks. It opened. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. I'd like to make this a real marriage, he said. If that's what you want. The kitchen was very still. It's what I want, she said. Well, the legal filing for the water rights was completed by the end of June, registered in Hayes County with the kind of documentation that made ambiguity impossible. Colton's lawyer in Dodge City was thorough and meticulous, and the paperwork that came back bore the county seal and the clear language of a settled claim. Webb sent one more letter in July. It was shorter than the first and offered a higher number. Colton signed the reply himself this time, standing at the kitchen counter, and handed it to Danny without comment. Pruitt came to the ranch once more, in early July, and this time Colton was in the yard when he rode up. Evelyn watched from the porch, not hiding. She had no reason to hide, while the two men talked at a distance that had nothing comfortable in it. Pruitt did most of the talking. Colton did very little of it. At one point, Pruitt looked toward the porch, and she met his eyes with the same level patience she'd developed for things that wanted to make her feel small. And he looked away first. When Pruitt had gone, Colton came to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps. He mentioned Helen, he said. I expected he would. He said I was dishonoring her memory by... He stopped. By what we have here. She looked at him carefully. What did you say? I said Helen would have had him off the property in 30 seconds, and she'd have done it more politely than I was managing. He looked at the gate where Pruitt had gone. I think that's true. From what you've told me, yes. She was... He paused. She wasn't replaceable. I want to be clear about that. I know, Evelyn said. I'm not trying to replace her. He looked up at her. Clara doesn't need a replacement mother, she said. She needs what she has. Her father reading to her again, and someone who checks that her boots are on the right feet and her braids are even. She paused. I'm not Helen. I'm not trying to be. What I'm building here is its own thing. He held her eyes. Yes, he said, it is. He came up the steps and went inside, and as he passed her, she had the sense of something that had been carefully balanced for a long time, finding a new center of gravity, not falling, just shifting into a position that could hold more weight. Clara had been watching all of it. Of course she had. She had watched everything since she was 6 years old, with a notebook in her hand, and her father's instruction that you should write down what you observed before memory changed it. And she was not going to stop now that the most interesting developments in the history of Silver Ridge Ranch were happening at close range. She showed Evelyn the notebook on a Saturday in late July. Not all of it. The early part she kept private, with the seriousness of a person who understood that some records were for the archivist and not for public review. But she opened it to the section that started with Evelyn's arrival, and she set it on the kitchen table and stepped back in the manner of someone presenting something they had worked hard on and were cautiously proud of. Evelyn read it. It was, as Clara had promised from the first week, a record of what she observed. The first entries were brief and factual: the carpetbag, the question about food, the first meal. As the weeks progressed, the entries got longer and more complex, the way a child's understanding of a thing grew with more data. There was an entry about the morning in the garden after Colton's first absence that simply said, "She came outside before I did." The garden was already half done. There was an entry about Walt's arm that took half a page, written with the specific attention of someone who had been frightened and was processing it through documentation. There was an entry about the evening Evelyn had told her father about Pruitt and Webb, written from what Clara could hear from the top of the stairs, which was apparently quite a lot. The last entry, written in the neat, careful hand of a girl who took her record-keeping seriously, said, "Papa laughed at breakfast today. Not the kind of laugh that's just polite, the real kind. I hadn't heard it in 3 years. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget what it sounded like. Evelyn made the eggs too salty, and he laughed about it. She said she knew, and she'd fix it. He said don't. She said why not? He said because it gives me something to complain about, and I've been running out of things." Then they both laughed. "I wrote it down because I don't want to forget this either." Evelyn closed the notebook and looked at Clara, who was watching her with the careful expression of someone who had given something personal and was waiting to see if it had been received properly. "The eggs were too salty," Evelyn said. "A little," Clara said. "I fixed it the next time." "I know. He didn't complain." Clara paused. "I think he missed it." Evelyn looked at the notebook. "This is a remarkable record, Clara. It's just what happened. The best records usually are." She pushed the notebook back across the table. "You should keep it, all of it, including the parts from before I came." Clara picked it up and held it the way she always held it, pressed to her chest, a habit so old it was unconscious now. "Do you think it matters, what I write?" "I think it's how you understand the world," Evelyn said. "That's not a small thing." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Papa reads to me most nights now." "I know. He read me 3 chapters last night. We stayed up too late and he didn't say anything about it." She looked at her notebook. She searched for the word she'd used before, months ago, which felt much longer ago than it was. "The volume is coming back up." Evelyn looked at her and thought about what it cost a child to carry a grief that wasn't hers to carry, to watch a parent go dim, and quietly decide to document everything in case more was lost. She thought about a 6-year-old starting a notebook out of fear of forgetting. "Clara," she said. The girl looked up. "You did good work," Evelyn said. "Keeping everything, paying attention, waiting." Clara blinked. It was the blink of someone who had not been told that before in those terms. "I was just watching." "Watching is work," Evelyn said, "especially when what you're watching is hard." Clara looked down at her notebook and then back up. "Is it going to stay like this?" she asked. "The way it is now?" It was the question under all the other questions, the one a child who had lost something irreplaceable and then spent 3 years watching everything carefully to make sure she didn't lose anything else needed to ask. Evelyn thought about honesty and what it owed people who needed it. "I don't know what will happen," she said. "Nobody does. Pruitt may keep causing trouble. The summer may be dry. Things break and people make mistakes, and sometimes the eggs are too salty." She paused. "But I'm not leaving, and your father is not going to let what we've built here come apart. And you're going to keep writing it all down." She looked at the girl steadily. "So whatever comes, it'll be faced with more people than you had before." That's not nothing. Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she nodded, once, the way her father nodded when something had been said that didn't need adding to. She went out to the garden. August moved into September. The way Kansas late summers did, in a gradual easing of heat that was welcome and then suddenly almost sad. The acknowledgement that the year was turning, that what had been planted was either grown or wasn't, that accounts came due. The garden had exceeded what she'd hoped. The beans had done well, the squash had done extremely well, and Mabel's 6 varieties had given them more variety than the root cellar had seen in years. The preserving had taken most of August, she and Clara, and occasionally Mabel, working the kitchen in the serious, concentrated way of people who understood that this work in summer was what made winter manageable. Amos had stopped by the kitchen one afternoon in September, ostensibly about supply coordination, and had looked at the rows of jars on the pantry shelves and said nothing for a moment. Then he'd said, 14 years, and left, which she'd understood to mean that the pantry had not looked like that in 14 years, and that this was his way of marking it. She'd put that in her own notes. The Pruitt matter had quieted, though it hadn't resolved. Webb sent no more letters after September. Colton's lawyer had done his work carefully, and the water rights documentation was solid, and at some point the calculation had shifted, not disappeared, but become less immediately actionable. Pruitt rode past the ranch gate twice in September and didn't stop. He was a patient man, but patience had its own costs, and he was paying them. Reeves said, laconically, at supper one evening, "Pruitt's asking around about the Hendricks place north of town might be moving his attention." "That'll take a while," Colton said. "Yes," Reeves said. "Good." That was the end of that conversation, which was about as much celebration as Silver Ridge ran to. The evening Evelyn thought of later, not as the most dramatic or the most decisive, but as the one that felt most true, was an ordinary one in early October. The kitchen was warm, the stove was going properly on both sides because the new baffle plate had come in August, and Danny had installed it with considerable pride in only 2 wrong attempts, and now the oven ran even and she'd stopped compensating for the left side, and the biscuits were consistently themselves. Clara was at the table doing sums from the school book that Evelyn had ordered from the catalog in July, and occasionally she would look up at the sums and then write something in her notebook, which was not the sums, and then look back at the sums again. Colton was in the study with the door open. She could hear him turning pages. She was putting up the last batch of apple preserves. The orchard at the Garfield place had been generous this year, and Mabel had sent over 2 bushels with Jacob. And the kitchen smelled of cooked apple and cinnamon, and the particular warmth of a house that was operating the way a house was meant to operate, with people in it doing the things they needed to do, and the stove burning steady, and someone knowing where everything was. Danny knocked on the back door at 7:30 with a question about the morning's work schedule, which was a question he could have asked in the morning, and which she suspected was actually a visit thinly disguised as a question. And she gave him the answer and handed him 2 biscuits from the tin and sent him back to the bunkhouse. And she heard him outside telling someone, Curtis probably, that the apple preserves were going to be something. You could smell them from the yard. Clara looked up from her sums. "He does that every night." I know. He's hoping there's extra." "There usually is." Clara smiled, the small private smile she kept for things she found genuinely funny but didn't want to make too much of. She looked back at her sums. Then, without looking up, she said, "Evelyn." "Yes." "In my notebook, the first entry." A pause. "I wrote that you were the new one." "I remember. The last entry from today." She stopped. "I crossed that out." Evelyn looked at her. Clara kept her eyes on her sums. "I wrote instead that you're just Evelyn. That's all. Just Evelyn." She turned a page. "I thought you should know." The kitchen was warm and the preserves were going, and from down the hall came the sound of Colton turning a page. And outside, the October wind was starting to feel like October, which meant winter was making its plans, and the ranch would turn inward the way ranches did in November, tighter and more reliant on itself, and everything Evelyn had spent 6 months building. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with a carpetbag and $31 and no clear idea of what you were going to find. She thought about what you couldn't know from a folded advertisement in the back of a newspaper, the weight of a 9-year-old's careful record, the sound of a man's real laugh, The specific resistance of Kansas soil in early spring, the way a stove that ran hot on the left side became, once you understood it, just the stove. She thought about the things she'd believed about herself before she'd come here. That she was too old to start again, too marked by failure, too accustomed to being managed down into something smaller than she was. She thought about how wrong those beliefs had been. Not because Kansas had fixed her, or Colton Hayes had rescued her, or any of the easier stories you could tell about a woman starting over, but because she had done what she'd always done. She had shown up and taken stock and started with what was in front of her. The pantry, the list, the cold kitchen. The girl who noted whether you fed her before you asked about the fortune. The man who watched everything and decided nothing quickly and had his reasons and had paid for them without quite understanding yet what he'd been paying. You couldn't build something lasting on the idea of what a place could give you. You built it on what you were willing to give the place. That was the whole of it, and it wasn't a romantic idea, it was a practical one, and practical had stopped seeming like the opposite of meaningful. Somewhere around the second week when Clara had handed her a notebook entry that said, "That's the best first page so far," and she'd turned back to the stove and blinked hard at nothing. What she had built here was not perfect. The oven had been fixed, but the porch step was still a temporary repair. Colton was less silent than he'd been, but he was still a man who processed grief slowly and sometimes went quiet in ways that needed patience rather than conversation. Clara was remarkable, but she was also 9 and occasionally impossible in the way of 9-year-olds who were too smart for the available instruction and knew it. The Pruitt situation was quiet but not resolved. The ranch was prosperous, but prosperity was not a wall. None of that was the point. The point was that it was hers. Not because Colton had said so at the corral fence in June, though he had, and she held that. Not because of the ceremony in Dodge City on a Thursday in August. But because she had come here and worked and paid attention and refused to be made small, and the place had opened to her the way places open to people who took them seriously. She put the last jar on the shelf. Colton appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd been in the study long enough that the house had settled into evening around him, and he wore the particular slightly loose quality of a man who had been somewhere interior for a while and was coming back. "Preserves are done," she said. He looked at the shelf. Something in his face did what she'd come to think of as the accounting look, but the accounting was different now. Not measuring her, but measuring what was in the room, adding it up, finding that it came to more than the sum of its pieces. "Good," he said. Clara looked up from her sums. "He's been in the study reading again," she told Evelyn, in the confidential tone of someone sharing significant intelligence. "I know," Evelyn said. "The shelf is getting less dusty," Clara observed. Colton looked at his daughter. "You're supposed to be doing sums." "I did the sums." She held up the notebook. "Then I wrote about the sums." "What is there to write about sums?" "The ones I got wrong," she said. "I write down the wrong ones so I understand why they were wrong. That way I don't make the same mistake again." She looked at him with the direct clarity she'd inherited from him, and which she wielded without knowing it. "You said write down what you observe. Being wrong is an observation." Colton looked at his daughter for a moment, then at Evelyn, then back at Clara. "That's correct," he said. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, not in the direction of the study or anywhere else, just at the table, which was where the evening was and where his family was, and which was apparently where he intended to be. Evelyn poured coffee and set it in front of him and sat down herself, and Clara turned another page in her notebook, and the stove kept its steady heat, and Silver Ridge Ranch held all of them inside its ordinary evening the way a well-built thing holds what it was built to hold. Not perfectly, not without its history of repairs, but solidly and with the full intention of continuing. That was enough, more than enough. It was in the end the only kind of home worth having, not the one that asked nothing of you, but the one that asked everything and gave back more than you'd known to want.